Okay. I have the pleasure of introducing Graham Burnett. Graham Burnett is an associate professor of history at Princeton University, where he recently held the Christian Gauss preceptorship and directed the program in history of science. He studied history and philosophy of science at Cambridge University on a Marshall Scholarship and was a member of Trinity College. He has taught at Yale and Columbia Universities and serves on the board of directors of the Vermilion Sea Institute. His books include Masters of All They Surveyed, University of Chicago Press, and A Trial by Jury. Now, Graham met me,
4 or 5 years ago?
Yeah, 4 or 5 years ago when he was doing archival research on the archives of the IWC, International Whaling Commission, that the Smithsonian Archives has. He is interested in how the science of marine mammalogy evolved in conjunction with the whaling industry. Okay, and he has written a book, Trying Leviathan, and he is going to give a presentation on it. Graham?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have a chance to talk to you about this book. And what I'd like to do, about how much time?
An hour.
Something like that? Okay, we'll leave plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. I see some familiar faces in the audience, which is nice too. So what I thought I would do is talk primarily about this book, which just came out last fall, and which is a work in the history of science. And I'll talk a little bit about what the book's about. I'll talk a little bit about the structure of the book, and I'll talk about some of the themes of the book, and then open the floor. But before I get to this book, I'm going to tell you where this book came from, because it actually links to the work that Jim talked about to begin with. So about, it's now 6 years ago, when I started at Princeton as junior faculty, I embarked on a research project that was going to, I hope, get me tenure. And I decided that the project I wanted to undertake was a study of scientific understanding of whales and dolphins from something like the 17th century through to the 20th century. The idea would be to do a big, the historians call it a longue durée, the whole sweep of the thing. And my endpoints from a cultural perspective would be whales as soulless, mindless monster beasts, think, Renaissance, late Renaissance, to whales as soulful, musical friends of humanity, bellwethers of human environmental irresponsibility, totems of the counterculture movement. You guys know that story very well. What interested me was not, though, that kind of cultural history arc, simply, but rather the connections between those changing cultural preoccupations with these animals and scientific knowledge of the animals. So it was my contention, as I wrote my NSF grant applications and so forth, that changing scientific ideas about whales and dolphins had enormous impacts on cultural preoccupations with the animals, and that we would discover some flow going the other way. That changing cultural preoccupations with these animals would affect the kind of scientific work that one could do with them and that one sought to do with them. So that was the big project. And I set to work again 5 or 6 years ago and dug in at all the interesting points. So did a bunch of archival work on Remington Kellogg, a name to conjure with here, whose papers are across the mall. Did a bunch of work on science and policy, the scientific advising system of the IWC in the critical years between sort of 1950 and what I consider the critical years for the evolution of that organization, 1950 to 1965. There's some interesting stuff that happens later as well, but I think that that's the heartland for understanding how scientific advising evolved in the IWC. Did a bunch of work on a major oceanographic undertaking that may be familiar to some of you. What people are do we have a bunch of marine biologists but then also all kinds of people, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So the discovery investigations, I wonder if that name lives in people's memories. Right. So the discovery investigations, the reports of which were published well into the 1960s, maybe even into the 1970s. That was a British oceanographic expedition originated in the interwar period, and some of you may know its origins lay in the fact that the British claimed colonial possession over South Georgia Island, and South Georgia Island was the point from which the Antarctic whaling industry was prosecuted during the period before the development of stern slipway vessels, those big pelagic factory vessels. Before those were developed, it was a shore whaling industry using mechanized catcher vessels and Sven Foyn-style harpoons for shooting and killing the whales. That was all done under British colonial auspices through South Georgia. They very cleverly put a tax on the whale oil that was landed there. It was all being collected by Norwegians, of course, who were the main members of the industry. Brits taxed that and used that money to fund what was at the time by far the largest oceanographic undertaking ever contemplated, outstripping the Challenger by several, I won't say by orders of magnitude in financing, but nevertheless much better funded. I did archival work in Scotland and in London on the discovery investigations, and really the emergence of a discipline that was at the time called cetology, though that usage fell out over the course of the 1950s, and the story of why that term gets sort of lost in some ways is itself an interesting historical story to which we can return. So I did all what I thought were the interesting bits, including, and we may want to talk about this at the end because it's by far the sort of sexiest and funniest and craziest part of the story, the archives of John C. Lilly, whose papers were acquired by Stanford University about 8 or 10 years ago. Lilly, some of you may know, was a kind of renegade neurophysiologist who was probably the most important figure, for better or for worse, in the discovery of the idea that whales are super intelligent. He did work with Tursiops, had a set of Navy contracts to use the animals as model organisms for interspecies communication. He had NASA money as well, built himself a dedicated research lab in the Caribbean, and then tuned in, turned on, and dropped out between 63 and 65. Many were lost. He had a contract with the National Institutes of Mental Health for LSD, which was, of course, at the time being used experimentally in veterans hospitals as an aid to talk therapy and as an active promoter of communication. And because his brief involved communicating with dolphins and understanding dolphin communication, he came to believe this would be a useful tool in that experimental work, deployed it on the dolphins, and the rest is, and gave it to himself as part of an effort to commensurate himself with the dolphins. And it's easy to laugh now. I mean, it is easy to laugh now. And when I present on that material, which I'm, again, tragically not doing for you today, have me back and I'll do my Lilly material. Because he ends up with, again, some of you will remember this, but he also decides that women will be especially good at communicating with dolphins, and women are also especially great to put in tanks with dolphins in bikinis, and pretty soon the research industry is like him and Carl Sagan and like Aldous Huxley all hang out in the swimming pool with the hostesses from the hotels in St. Thomas trying to communicate with the dolphins, and the rest is kind of history. So it's a very strange episode, and in part, what I'm always at pains to do when I present on that material, sort of in a formal history of science community, or with folks like you, if I were doing that, we have to remind ourselves there were lots of people giving LSD to lots of different animals: fish, dogs, birds, monkeys. It was people were experimenting with what the drug could do. So now it seems to us straightforwardly preposterous to be giving LSD to dolphins, but it was not the case. This is what you have to have the historians around for, so that they recover the past out from underneath what happens later. He was getting funding from the military to be doing this work because it seemed like important work at the time. It was really only after Leary and the emergence of the counterculture that LSD became LSD as we know it now, and suddenly his work was no longer in such good odor. But Lilly's work on dolphins was extremely important for what became the kind of global preoccupation with the large whales in the decade to come. One of the assistants in his lab, Scott McVeigh, went on to be the co-author on Soane's Humpback Whale in Science in 1972. McVeigh was using techniques that he'd learned in Lilly's lab. This is part of what I can demonstrate as a result of this archival work. Another kind of Lilly-type guy, a name that may be known to you, is Paul Spong. So Paul Spong did work in psychology, testing the auditory thresholds of odontocetes. He was enormously enamored of Lilly and did his PhD at UCLA right about the time that Norris was out there. And he goes to Vancouver, and he too, between 65 and 72, tunes in, turns on, and drops out in a slightly different way. After working with an orca at the Vancouver Aquarium, he believes he has a kind of breakthrough experience where the animal is experimenting on him. He joins up with a quirky group of Quakers out in Vancouver and a few freaks, and that is, anybody know? Greenpeace. And Greenpeace was protesting French nuclear weapons testing in the Pacific, and it's Paul Spong, again a Lilly offshoot, who draws their attention to the plight of the whales of the North Pacific, which are being hunted outside of IWC strictures because of various complicated IWC negotiations by the Soviets. And the rest, again, is very much a critical element of that history. 1975, Spong and his buddies successfully confront Soviet whalers and produce some of the most dramatic footage for the emerging environmental movement, footage that plays a very important role in how we think about heroic confrontations with exploiters of nature and so forth. So these are different elements of the story I set out to research. And one of those elements, just one little tidbit of all of that, was a 19th century part of the story that I initially thought would just be the introduction to the book. It would tell the story of this incredibly weird trial, the records of which I discovered while I was doing this kind of sweeping survey of everything cool related to science and whales between 1700 and the moratorium, basically 1980. So I come upon the records of this trial, and the trial involved a dispute in the early 19th century in New York, in which a jury had to decide, for the purpose of New York state law, whether a whale was a fish. Okay? And I'll get to why that becomes a question at law before we're finished. But I thought, this will be great. These guys I found the trial testimony. For a historian of science, it's very exciting because historians of science are very interested in what scientists have figured out, but in some ways we're even more interested in the process by which scientists figure out what they claim they know, and the process by which they kind of succeed in persuading others that they've got the right answer when there are kind of still a number of competing ways of accounting for things. That's really what excites us, not just picking, all the 6 most important papers in Nature that are on a topic over 50 years and sort of lining them up, but showing the stuff that you guys know about so well, which is that each one of those papers was the product of a hell of a lot of jockeying and trying to establish and bringing new results and peer review, and all that juicy stuff when the question is still open. We like to try to recover that so we can show how it is that knowledge gets made, not just kind of rehearse what was known. And that work is very hard to do because those records you can't just search them on Medline the way you can the nature articles, right? I mean, you have to get down into people's papers, you have to try to recover their laboratory practices, you have to see knowledge aborning, and that is tough. One of the great places to do that is a trial, because trials are agonistic settings where adversarial encounters and cross-examination force people to say not just what they know, but how they know it, and then somebody shows up and is like, that guy's got it ass backwards, let me cite a different set of sources, all of which point in a different direction. So you can see sort of a view in time of where the production of knowledge is. And these trial records were extremely juicy on a big question. A big question that wasn't really in the end just about whales, because what was at issue was larger shifts in understanding of the natural order between Linnaeus and Darwin. So probably a number of you are systematists here or interested in systematics, possibly all. And you probably have a sense of the enormous importance of Linnaeus in the history of taxonomy. You probably also have a sense of important changes in core ideas about systematics that occurred between sort of 1790 and 1825 with the work of Cuvier and Geoffroy in the Paris Museum, a move toward what comes to be called comparative anatomy, a look to the inside of organisms and an emphasis on physiology and the role of physiological systems in establishing taxonomic hierarchies. All that stuff was going on right in the heartland of this period, and whales were one of the classic anomalous organisms that raised trouble for the old and new systematic systems. They clearly weren't quadrupeds, which was the category that would have been deployed for most of the 18th century for an air-breathing beast-type animal. But their internal anatomy was, when you started to look closely, more or less indistinguishable from the creatures that get called quadrupeds. So the emergence of the category mammal, a term that makes some people quite uneasy in the early 19th century, we no longer hear quite so clearly in mammal, mammal, breast, but that was heard very clearly by people at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, and the notion that you would reframe the whole structure of nature and all God's creatures on the basis of a kind of slightly inappropriate feature of the female anatomy struck a lot of people as just queer, really. I mean, just not sort of right, not on. And when you couple that with the fact that this new comparative anatomy work that was promoting the notion of mammal and promoting the proximity between humans and creatures like whales that were a product of that new systematics, when you add that all this stuff is coming from where? Paris, notoriously atheistical, louche, erotically overcharged, and inappropriate type French people, just made it all the more anathema to the ideas of right-thinking individuals, not just in the United States, but very much in the United States. So I'll talk more about how that plays out when I unfold a little bit of how the story works. All of this is to say that this trial stuff I thought would make a great introduction to the big book, because these guys argue about all the systematics and taxonomy and ideas about whales, and they have whalemen in to give testimony, and it's a veritable smorgasbord for anybody who's interested in what was known about whales. I thought it would be the perfect setup, opening chapter. Sat down to write the opening chapter, and you guys already know what happened. Pushed away from the desk some number of months later, I won't say how long, and I clearly didn't have an introduction. I had something else, some monstrous fat thing that was not going to be fitted in any longer to the other book project. And so that's how we ended up. I basically calved it off and reshaped it, and it's a standalone book. that is still about whales for sure, but is even more about these changing ideas about systematics and taxonomy. It gets at those questions via whales, because whales are probably the most important problematic organism in this period. There's another problematic organism, some of you may know, bats. Bats are really annoying because they're much more like, they're like birds, according to like the old, biblical pre-Linnaean systematics of milieu. If what you're interested in is sort of building a taxonomic system that prioritizes mode of life above all other things, then whales are obviously fish because they're in water, and bats are pretty much obviously birds because they fly. But like whales, the internal anatomy of a bat is more or less indistinguishable from that of a host of little hairy quadrupeds, and so they too were annoying organisms. They were perhaps even more annoying in certain ways because, again, some of you may know that Linnaeus made the bat the fourth taxon within the larger genus Homo. So it was one of the species under the genus Homo. It was Homo vespertillo, the bat man, as opposed to Homo sapiens, and then the kind of Homo savage, a kind of ill-developed creature, and then monkeys were the fourth. So I'm going to now tell you a little bit about what I do in this book, and I'll leave aside the other material we've been discussing, the 20th century material, with really just a promissory note. About 75 or 80% of that 20th century book is now finished, and I would hope that it would be out in another year or two. And for some of you who are more interested in science and policy issues in the 20th century, that's a book that I think would be more like directly on point with your interests. It's got 2 big chapters on Kellogg and his work founding the International Whaling Commission, and then a technical chapter on sort of how scientific advising, as it had been envisioned after World War II by the folks who put together the UN and the FAO and the IWC, how it tanked as badly as it did. I mean, the IWC was supposed to be this shining light for what it would mean to have a system of sustainable exploitation of natural resources managed by scientific advice, best practice and scientific advice. And the sad story of the failure of that through the 50s and the 60s is what I unfold using archival sources there. So, and that's where the Lily stuff is with the women and the dolphins and all that too. Back to the 19th century. What's at issue in trying Leviathan? How do you get whales as fish before a jury? James Maurice, plaintiff in this suit, complains of Samuel Judd, defendant in this suit, in custody and etc., of a plea that he rendered to said plaintiff the sum of $75 lawful money of the state of New York, which to him he owes and from him unjustly detains. For said defendant, heretofore, to wit, on the 1st day of July in the year of our Lord 1818, at the city and in the county of New York, and after the 31st day of March 1818, did possess in the city of New York 3 casks of fish oil. The said 3 casks of fish oil not having been gauged, inspected, and branded according to law, contrary to the form of the statute in such a case. So, I said I would do first subject to the book, and then I would do structure of the book, and then I would talk about themes. Subject of the book, a trial between 2 guys, James Maurice and Samuel Judd. James Maurice is the state-appointed inspector of fish oils. Okay, there's a law in New York State, you have to have fish oil inspected. Samuel Judd is a chandler, a guy who outfits ships and sells candle oil and candles and cooking oils as well. So one fine day, Mr. Maurice goes into the shop of Samuel Judd, and he inspects the barrels, and he gets paid for that inspection service. The holder of the barrels was obliged to pay a fee for the brand and the stamp, which affirmed that his products were what they said they were and could go to market. He finishes. Judd says, "Thank you very much." Maurice says, "What about those 3 barrels in the back?" Judd says, "Don't worry about those barrels." Maurice says, "Why not?" He says, "Those aren't fish oil." He says, "What do you mean they're not fish oil?" He says, "Yes, those are spermaceti oil." spermaceti oil being primarily the head matter, wax ester that you can get out of a spermaceti whale, and therefore it's not subject to your inspection. Maurice says, why not? So, well, because haven't you heard, Mr. Maurice? Haven't you been reading, you know, the recent declarations coming out of the Paris Museum? Whales aren't fish anymore. So I don't have to pay you. Maurice says, right, whales not fish. Very funny. Slaps the cuffs on him, down to the station house. They go, and the trial is on. Okay? Now, the part of the reason that I was able to find so much great stuff about this trial is that the trial galvanized New York City. It didn't just galvanize New York City, it galvanized the entire young republic. I found literally hundreds of newspaper stories about this trial from every state in the Union and half of the territories at that time. There were only about 20 states in the Union at this time, but we're talking like out in the Arkansas territories and in the hills of West Virginia, which was still, of course, just a kind of hinterland of the Commonwealth of Virginia. All those newspapers followed this case on a minute-by-minute basis. It was an enormous preoccupation. Why? Well, part of what I argue is that these changing ideas about natural order were kind of as explosive to the late 18th and early 19th century as we've come to think the Darwin business was in the 19th century. This was kind of the Scopes trial of the 19th century, and it got people pretty exercised. Another reason that the trial got people so exercised is that New York City had just embarked on an ultimately unsuccessful project to refashion itself as the kind of Athens of America. There had long been a slight prejudice against New York City as a mercenary city, whereas Boston, Philadelphia had a certain polish and culture. New York was a place, then as now, where it was about elbows, getting and spending. It was a rough and tumble place. And the then mayor of the city had decided that he was going to kind of rebrand the city as a philosophical emporium. And he had just invested very heavily in a kind of New York Royal Society. Is it you're not seeing so clearly? I promise I worry you guys, I'll lose you guys in this much darkness. We'll do it for a minute. We'll do it for a minute, but then I need my lights back on because I need to see you in order to be able to talk. Okay, so basically the city had just built a new city hall, and it had just erected this thing, which was supposed to be like New York's Royal Society. And they gathered all the kind of men of learning and institutions of learning. This is before Columbia University has been properly founded, before NYU exists. This basically is the kind of university and intellectual culture of New York City at the time. And it is funded by taxpayers. It contains all the scientists. It's like y'all's dream. Imagine that, it's like this, basically, right? It's the Smithsonian and the Capitol Hill being that close together. That's part of what's so neat. Here is that philosophical emporium, and here is the city hall. And this is where the trial took place, and this is where all the expert witnesses were. So basically you have these expert witnesses, all of whom are going to teach you about whales and fish, who kind of walk across the park to teach this new democratic community about the order of nature, and we'll see how they fare over the course of the next few minutes. A big issue that's at stake in this trial, which some of you may already have suspected, is the proper relationship between science and democracy. The United States is a crazy new experiment in 1818. It's a pretty radically democratic republic. And again, you all probably kind of intuitively think of science as an inherently democratic undertaking, and there are very good reasons that you think that, and there's an important history as to why we associate science with egalitarian, democratic, and how should we say, kind of individualistic strivings. However, before the French Revolution, 1789 or so, really the only people who had a lot of free time on their hands to be screwing around with air pumps and vacuums and whether or not plants could grow if they didn't have certain kinds of gases with them were, you probably already know this, noblemen, right, who had tons of time on their hands, or priests who also had sinecures who could mess about with this. So contrary to our current understanding of science as an inherently democratic understanding, the late 18th to early 19th century ideas about science were really that it was primarily aristocratic activity that was possibly even slightly tainted by clerical privilege. So if you're starting a new democracy and you have some laws and you have to interpret them in a court, and suddenly you get a bunch of guys in knickers with powdered wigs, sort of old-style Jeffersonian type guys, coming across the park to be like, well, we're going to sort you plebes out on this question. Hang on, I'll read to you in French and a little Latin. This went over not well with a lot of populist style, like proto-Jacksonian Democrats who said, no, we left all this stuff behind, right? This is the old world where guys show up in the funny outfits and tell you what for. This is a democracy. In a democracy, we interpret the laws. Laws are to be interpreted according to common usage of terms, not these fancy Latinate terms derived from huge fat books that we don't even print here in the United States, etc. Okay, so those are some of the larger issues that are at play. Let me talk about the structure of the book for a second. The book has basically built around 4 core chapters. This view is City Hall and that fancy new institution called the New York Institution. The book is built around 4 core chapters. And I built it a little bit like that joke about the 5 blind guys, I guess 4 blind guys and the elephant. You know, where everybody gropes the elephant, and one guy's like an elephant is like an oak tree, another guy's he's the guy who got the leg, guy gets the trunk, he's like, elephant is like a python, and everybody kind of comes together and they got their own view of the organism. The book is built around 4 chapters that represent the understanding of the whale by different kinds of people in the early republic. I want to know who knew what about these animals. So I use the 4 categories that are invoked at one point in the trial as being the potential people you would ask if you have to resolve the question of whether a whale is a fish. And what are those 4 categories? Ordinary New Yorkers, right? The kind of democratic principle. Men of science, right? Men of learning, university prof types. You don't call them scientists in this period if you're a really strict historian, because the term scientist, again, some of you may know this, the term scientist isn't coined until the late 1830s. The word scientist doesn't exist in the English language until about 1839, when it's coined ex nihilo by a guy named William Whewell, who was the master of Trinity College, Cambridge. And you again may be pleased to know this. He coined it directly as in parallel to the term artist. He wanted a term that referred to the investigation of nature that had about it the sound of the creative artist. And there was no such term, so he coined it, and it was picked up very rapidly, and that's why we call scientists scientists. However, before, if you don't want to be anachronistic, and historians get their knickers in a twist about anachronisms, you refer to them as philosophes or natural philosophers or men of learning and that kind of stuff. So, second category, men of science. Third category, whalemen, right, who had extremely intimate knowledge of these animals, grounded in their labor, indeed much more experience with the animals than the men of learning, who had book knowledge, but in very few cases had kind of actual intimate experience. And then the fourth category is what I call men of affairs, businessmen. Because this is, after all, business transaction, and the question of what business groups are at stake in this issue and what the people who produce these products know about the animals as a result of the processes by which the oils are tried out or cooked out or filtered or processed, etc. All of that ends up mattering before the trial is over. So those are my 4 groups. And what I'll do in the next few minutes is kind of briefly recapitulate how it goes with those 4 groups, like what we find out when we begin to sift for what those folks knew about the whales. And then I won't have time to do for you what happens when those different kinds of whale knowledge all go head to head in the courtroom, but that's really kind of the heart of the book. So part of the reason I zero you in here is that if you take a moment to consider what ordinary New Yorkers knew about whales, and they were packed into the galleries to listen to the trial testimony, I asked, is there any place a New Yorker could have seen a whale in 1818? Where would they have gone to learn about whales? And it turns out they could have gone here. Because in addition to this being a fancy new kind of acropolis of learning, it was, again, very much like the Smithsonian, also a museum. And an ordinary New Yorker could pay a quarter, and he could, or she could, be admitted to what was called the American Museum, run by a guy named John Scudder. And upstairs there were galleries of taxidermied creatures, and they were arranged in an order that was explicitly a kind of taxonomic order. And they had a bit of whale jaw. They didn't have a whole whale skeleton, but they had a whale jaw which had been brought from Long Island with great fanfare about 10 years before this trial. So much fanfare, in fact, that Scudder, ever the kind of entrepreneur, announced in the newspapers that he was going to set the whale jaw up on Broadway for a couple of weeks. It was a North Atlantic right whale jaw. He set the jaw up on Broadway and hired a probably phony Italian band who called themselves the Pandian Minstrels to play rousing dance tunes, and then people could come and they could dance under the jaw of the whale by the moonlight. And this was people loved this. The city went crazy for this between 1905 and about 1906. He took the whale jaw out, got it cleaned up because it got pretty stinky, as you can imagine, brought it back and set it up in the American Museum. Now, all of that is to say that New Yorkers could have seen a bit of whale. There had also been, I discovered doing incredibly tedious archival work, several public showings of whales in New York City in the decade before. So enterprising showmen, not Scudder, but other guys, would periodically, when there was a stranding, go ahead and slap a rope on the tail of the thing and drag it around to one of the docks on Wall Street, and again, put an ad in the paper, charge everybody a quarter, and let them see it. It is worth pointing out that New York had not had a very fresh stranding in a very long time, on the order of 50 years. There had been a whale that stranded in the Delaware River up almost to Trenton, species undetermined, but about 35 feet long. What it could have been maybe, Boo?
Yeah. Probably a small fin or a baby or...
yeah, so probably a small fin sounds plausible. So they took it from Trenton down to Philadelphia first, showed it for, count them, 2 months in Philadelphia, and then offloaded it to a guy from New York who towed it up and around to New York and showed it for another month in New York. And you know it was bad by then because his ads in the newspapers, which are how I figured all this out, say with increasing emphasis that despite the fact that the thing has a curious smell, it's not dangerous. It's like the natural smell of whale blubber, and people should not be put off by it. Ultimately, the health officials shut him down. Did ordinary New Yorkers think whales were fish? They absolutely did. This is a little textbook that was for sale around the corner from the trial, in the year of the trial, and this was printed in 1815. The History of Fish. And you can see the opening biblical quote here, and God created the great whales and every living creature that moveth, and you definitely have a spouting sort of whale-like thing there. Whales took up the whole first half of this book because they were the kings of the fish. They were the ultimate fish. They were the big fish. This line from Genesis cues you in to the durability of, among ordinary New Yorkers, of what I call I don't call it this, everyone calls it this, the biblical taxonomy. Those lines in first chapter of Genesis that say God created, right, fish that swim in the sea, beasts that creep on land, and birds that fly in the air. And that's the kind of authoritative textual basis of that milieu taxonomy, whereby everything in water, fish, everything in air, bird, everything on land, except human beings, interesting, right? Because human beings don't creep. That notion of the creeping is what makes quadrupeds so important, and is why the quadruped distinction is a happy one for the self-love of Homo sapiens, because it permits a systematic order that excludes human beings, right? We don't fit in that in any straightforward way. We're special. We're created separately. And so part of what was at stake in the collapse of the biblical natural historical system is very much human exceptional status. And that's part of the reason people come out in droves for this trial. At Scudder's Museum, interestingly, just as a tip to the fact that things were a little more confusing than just whales were fish, in Scudder's Museum, the whale jaw was not categorized in the fish category, but it wasn't categorized in the quadruped category either, and it wasn't categorized in the amphibian category. It was categorized in miscellaneous, which again cues you in to the fact that this was a kind of problematic creature. Now, what else was in Anomalous? This is one of my favorite parts of the book. Anomalous also contained 2 10-pound hairballs, which had been removed from the guts of a hog that lived on Spring Street in what is now Soho, which was at the time, still kind of farmland, and a model of the Palace of Saint-Cloud, complete with 135 mounted horsemen, all of which had been carved out of beef bones. So this gives you a sense of it. So it was those two things and then the whale jaw. And so, again, reading that kind of anthropologically, so it's funny, but at the same time, it's like kind of telling, because what you can see from that is that whales, they were probably fish. They were definitely weird. And what were they also? They were kind of wondrous. Because each of those things I just mentioned is like a freak, right? I mean, like a 10-pound hairball out of the gut of a hog. That's crazy. It's, wow, come and check it out. It's just disgusting, weird, and strange. It's a wonder. And in a similar, though not identical way, a crazed exercise of human craft done by a prisoner, that was the kind of people who did that kind of obsessive carving, was similarly a wonder. So whales were fish, but they were also kind of, everyone acknowledged, weird fish, wondrous, strange, anomalous fish. So that's the take-home point of what ordinary New Yorkers knew. This is Mitchell. Mitchell was, Samuel Lapham Mitchell was the most important expert witness. He was the founder of the New York Academy of Sciences, probably the most distinguished American man of science in this period, and the author of the most important monograph on ichthyology in American waters, circa 1818. He was a kind of universal man of learning of a sort that was a little bit on the wane by the 1820s, when increasing professionalization demands that you kind of have specialized knowledge as opposed to this kind of encyclopedic knowledge. He was more an encyclopedic character. Educated in Edinburgh primarily, medical doctor, and did spend some time in Paris as well as London. This is actually a doodle done of him by one of his students, so showing him, I think, unflatteringly, in my view. But yes, I warn my students, be careful of your doodles because they become historical. They become historical subject matter. How committed was Mitchell to comparative anatomy? This is weird. He was so committed to comparative anatomy. And then again, I want you guys to kind of feel like you're recovering how intense these questions were at the beginning of the 19th century. That before the trial, this is before the trial, Mitchell was going around basically tacking up broadsheets on, light posts in Manhattan, saying things like this: anatomy is the basis of improved zoology. The classification of animals is founded upon their organization. This can be ascertained only by dissection. The use of the knife is recommended for the purpose of acquiring acquaintance with the structure of animals. Thus, all citizens ought to avail themselves of all opportunities to cultivate comparative anatomy and to communicate the results of their labors and researches to the society. This guy was like an apostle for comparative anatomy in New York City. He tried to emphasize the democratic quality of it. Now again, feel the inclusiveness. He was a regular in the New York fish market, where he would go and conduct impromptu classes. He defended the virtues of being a naturalist in America with respect to the strengths of France by pointing out that we were closer to nature here. We had a lot more stuff than they did in Europe. They might have more libraries, but we had fishermen and trappers and furriers who could collect for us from all over North and Central and South America. And he had a wide ambit of correspondents who sent him samples and tidbits to identify. He was involved, it's hard to get into, but he was involved in so many interesting kind of natural historical controversies in the period. The famous debates over the mastodon, which some of you may know, the excavation of mastodons. Are they mastodons? I get confused between mammoths and mastodons. I got to be very careful in this audience. Mastodon. Okay, just want to get it right with you guys. There's a very complicated story we definitely don't have time to get into, but some of you may know a little bit that there had been a long-standing late 18th century tradition of disparaging American nature. That is, there was a belief that in America, the kind of soil conditions and moisture conditions basically caused the nuts of male organisms to kind of shrivel up and underperform. And this was a French theory, very supported by the Spanish, it's important to say. And it was a major obsession of guys like Jefferson. Again, some of this will be familiar to you. Their concern was that this was like a slight against America, which it was. I mean America in the geographical, not the political sense, which it was. And for those of you who know a little bit about Latin American history, you know that Spanish citizens who came to the New World and had children, Creole children, those Creole children were not permitted to hold political office back in Spain, no matter what the characteristics of their noble quarterings were. And that was because of this sense that if you'd been spawned here, you just didn't have the right juice because the soil and the moisture and all of that had corrupted your essential seed. And guys like Samuel Latham Mitchell were enormously concerned to rebut this. And one of the ways that it could be rebutted was by showing the vigor of American natural creations. And this was why the mastodon was so important, because one of the things that guys like Buffon, who made this argument about American nature, regularly pointed out is that there were basically no big animals in North America. Nothing like Africa, nothing like Asia, and not even really much like Europe. We had bison, but we didn't have elephants. We didn't have. So one of the reasons, again, that Lewis and Clark were sent out into the heartland by Jefferson was to get out there and find something huge so that they could protest against this. Mitchell worked on all of this kind of stuff. He worked on the sea monster craze, identifying what that was, et cetera, et cetera. He gets up on the stand. What does he say? As a man of science, I can say positively that a whale is no more a fish than a man, and nobody pretends to the contrary nowadays but lawyers and politicians. So he gives it to the court with both barrels. Now, I'll touch on this very quickly, but then I'm going to have to speed up because I want to leave time for questions. I want, again, to confirm for you the importance of these issues so that it's both kind of fun but also serious. This is the cross-examination of Mitchell, a little speech to the jury by an exceptionally irresponsible and brilliant Irish Jacobin lawyer named William Sampson, who was the counsel to James Maurice. He was the whale is a fish guy. That's the case he was arguing. And he was probably the most famous lawyer in the city at the time. So this whole event would be like kind of Johnny Cochran cross-examining Stephen Jay Gould on intelligent design or something like that. That's what I'm trying to imagine going on. It's just like, it's people are going bananas here. So this is what Sampson says. We have a statute which declares that every free man shall be entitled to a vote at our public elections. Let us suppose, then, that at some one of those arduous struggles where everything in the shape of a man had been, by the zeal of politicians, urged to the hustings, that the learned doctor here had appeared, leading forward with all due gravity to the polls an orangutan, or a man of the woods. Would this stranger's vote be received, although the doctor should very learnedly and eloquently urge his claims, as he has done those of the whale on the present occasion? He breathes the vital air, the doctor might say, through lungs. He moves erect and has warm blood. The female brings forth her young alive and rears the bantling at her breasts. The inspectors would say in reply to all the eloquence and learning of the doctor, as we do in the case of the whale, all this is indeed very strange and curious. But still, doctor, it is a monkey in common acceptation, however naturalists may choose to hail and class him as a brother. So, you feel a kind of slight low move into the room because, of course, what you're feeling is that this is an explicit invocation of the extremely violent showdowns that had occurred over the free black franchise in the state of New York and elsewhere in the North in the early 19th century. This choose to hail and class him as a brother invidiously invokes the motto of the Aboriginal Protection Society, one of the manumission societies, which was a picture of a black man in chains, and it said, "Am I not a man and a brother?" So this is, what is at issue here is, if you let the men of science come in and lecture to you about natural order, who knows where it stops? Maybe it's just all in good fun with the whales and the fish, but then why wouldn't they next come and tell us that on the basis of science, black people are the same kind of creature as white people? And are you ready for that? And what if they were to come next and say that women are the same kinds of rational creatures as men? Are you ready for that too? So the stakes of letting the men of science instruct the Republic were very high, and that is explicitly at issue in the course of the trial. Okay, so I'll spend just 2 minutes on what is in some ways my favorite part of the book, the Whalemen. They called 2 whalemen to give testimony in this trial, and one of them is a before-the-mast sailor and the other is a captain. Unfortunately, they do not agree. The captain says, absolutely not, whales are not fish. I read the encyclopedia, I'm a very learned guy, and haven't you guys heard the latest stuff coming out of France? They're not fish. Ordinary whalemen before the mast is like, news to me, they aren't fish. I mean, we always called them fish. In fact, when we would say, yeah, how many fish did you get today? It would be like 1 fish, 2 fish, 3 fish. So they're fish. In this section of the book, I spent more time than I would like to admit in the logbooks of 19th-century whaling vessels, attempting to glean in the between the lines of those journals vernacular ideas about the physiology and taxonomy and natural history of whales. What did whalemen know about those animals? They didn't write treatises. So if you're going to figure that out as a historian, you're going to have to do some kind of rolling up the sleeves scut work in the manuscripts. And I find some pretty interesting things, I think, which I unfortunately don't really have time to do in detail. But I'll very quickly touch on both a physiological feature and an anatomical of the feature of the animals that the whalemen had a really surprising grasp of. This is a drawing from a whaleman's logbook. It is of a specific whale that was caught on a specific voyage. And the whaleman uses it also as a kind of exemplary whale to specify some things he thinks that people might be interested in knowing about the animals. So for instance, this, which is obviously a lance, is not just a lance, it's also number 11, and number 11 in the key is a pointer, pointing to what is called the life of the animal. So in other words, this is a kind of external marker of what those guys understood as a physiological characteristic of the animal, namely the point of its greatest vulnerability, the point, I suspect, to the front of the ribs, but with greatest access to the heart and lungs, which was the kind of vital zone. So when they were going to do the animal in, they went for the life. And similarly, these guys had mapped onto the outsides of these animals all kinds of specific locations about their internal operations, all for the better to kill them. I mean, hunters know their prey. That's the take-home point. They also had to take these animals apart at sea, and if you look, you'll see that there are lines drawn on the head. Those are rudimentary cutting-in diagrams showing how they would dissect these animals in the water. And I recovered a whole bunch of these crazy accounts of how to cut the animals up. Melville talks a little bit about this in Moby Dick. This is one of my favorite things. This is an artifact showing that spiraling pattern for peeling the blubber and showing the means by which you break up the head into the case and the junk and the white horse and all of that, which are the processing parts. And that was almost certainly used as a pedagogical instrument, as a tool to teach young sailors on board the boat. It's made out of wood and carved. They also, whalemen did, included keys like this in their logbooks, showing all of the animals. This looks a little bit like a regular natural history textbook from the period, but with the characteristic distinction that all the whales are shown spouting blood, which is the sort of thing that a whaleman would like. Did whalemen think whales were fish? Well, they did and they didn't. This is the kind of thing that historians spend a lot of time looking for. This is a manuscript speech given by a whaleman at a lyceum about the natural history of whales in 1830. We've just published this text, which had never been published before, and this is the manuscript version held in the New Bedford Whaling Museum, and you can see here that he's written the word whale, and then he's crossed it out, and he's written in the word fish up above, which is an indication that he had considered the two interconvertible, but wasn't sure which was more appropriate to use. I'm basically going to stop there, saying only that in the end, things get really juicy when you get to the men of affairs. Before this book is over, I can show that this case isn't just a kind of minor commercial transaction gone awry, but a formal test case in which two very powerful groups, rival economic groups in New York City, are kind of vying for control over the law and over commerce. Basically, you have guys like this oil merchant, Thomas Hazard, who say, look, I don't care about whales and I don't care about fish. What I know is that the distinction between meal and flour is not more known than that between whale and fish oil, or between wheat and buckwheat. If anyone were to order fish oil and I were to answer by sending him whale oil, it would be the same as if he had ordered sugar and I had sent molasses. These things have different prices. They're made in different ways. For the merchant, price is taxonomy, right? I mean, either they're interconvertible or they're not, and money is what lets you know that. By contrast, here's the guy who basically lies underneath much of this controversy, who subsequently becomes mayor of the city of New York, the most powerful tanner, leather worker in the city, which was a major industry at the time and a major user of fish and whale oil. We use the general term fish to comprehend them all. I mean we, the plain men who carry on the substantial business of this great world, and however naturalists have made other distinctions and classifications for other purposes, we disregard them. In the course of our common pursuits, we call all marine animals fish and all land animals quadrupeds. Witness then laid on the table parcelled letters, invoices, and bills of lading, also printed price currents from Liverpool, London, Bordeaux, Amsterdam, Baltimore, Boston, and New York, all of which agreed essentially with this testimony. So I want to make sure we have just a couple minutes for questions. I've gone on much too long. I appreciate your patience, and I get to see you guys were with me, so I enjoyed that. And I'm going to stop here and just give us some time to do Q&A. Thank you very much. Can you do the lights back up? The lights back up, is that okay? Thoughts, questions? Yeah.
You said it was a jury trial?
It was a jury trial.
Do you know the makeup of the jury?
I do. This incredible thing has happened in the last 10 years for historical research, and that is that almost all of the newspapers of the United States before about 1850 are now fully digitized and full-text searchable. So whereas 15 years ago it would have been impossible to recover the composition of the jury, now I was able to do a set of searches and find clues that let me look other places to find out who these guys were. So, one guy had to do a public listing of a piece of real estate that he needed to sell, so I could figure out where he lived and then I could follow it up. So, all men, all property-owning men. You have to be able to vote to be on a jury. And a middling sort of folk. There were 2 auctioneers, so people who made their business calling and selling. There was a guy who'd run a brewery for a period of time. There was a publican, a guy who had a pub. There was a master furniture maker. And there was, it's sort of high manual crafts are also represented. So master furniture maker is kind of a high manual craft. No day laborer kinds of guys at all. But also the bottom end of what we would consider sort of white collar jobs are also represented. There was a lawyer, but he was a kind of demi-monde lawyer who'd been disbarred and was kind of not an especially savory character in certain ways. So that gives you a feel for the kind of community of folk. I'm at some pains in the book to show that they are very much the kind of people for whom something like the American Museum was intended. Though that was the kind of social complexion of the folks who would come to the museum on an evening where in the summer where they had it all illuminated and there was a string quartet or something playing. Aspiring folks from polite culture would be the answer.
So what was the nature of the decision, was it a written or just a yay or no?
Yeah. So I'm torn. I'm always torn about to what because the structure of the book hinges so much on the kind of suspension of the verdict. I'm going to declare right here. I'm not going to say what the verdict is. I'm sorry to do that to you. No, you can even just go online and look it up. Lots of people will say there are plenty of reviews of the book, so you don't have to buy the book. But the reason I say that is I've written actually 2 books about juries. Jim mentioned that I did a book called Trial by Jury. I never would have written this book. Never would have written this book. We never would have imagined how this book could have been written if, and here I get personal for a moment, in 1999 I had been called for jury duty in New York City and ended up, if you can believe it, as the foreman of the jury in a murder trial in Manhattan. 3 weeks in a little room, a week of, not a full week, 4 days, 3 nights of sequestered deliberations over an extremely difficult case. And that book, I mean, that experience kind of changed my life in many ways. I was already a historian of science, but that made me super interested in the relationship between science and law. I just edited a special issue of the History of Science Journal on the sort of intersection between science and law, in part as a result of that experience. And I think I imagined the structure of this book as I did because of that experience. Now, in that book, I say what the verdict is in the first page, because the subject of that book is the deliberative process, not the trials. What I'm interested in is recovering how 12 people reach their verdict, and I can tell that story, and it's not a story that is often known. Sort of, some of you have probably been on juries, you have a sense of it. It's complicated. In this book, I need the kind of structure of the verdict to kind of pull people through a good deal of kind of history of science stuff. So here I don't, just as a kind of narrative decision, give it away. But I will say that the jury's verdict was ultimately, it's a spoken verdict. They're asked by the judge, the recorder, what their verdict is. They give it pretty promptly, and then the whole thing goes up on appeal. So there's another round of complicated stuff where they actually jury-rig the law out from underneath, and the end game of the book, which I promise is not too long or too boring, deals with the way in which these 2 powerful groups of citizens in New York are vying for control. And just so you can feel that there's a point to all of that, part of what I want to show is the enormous importance of natural history in the early republic in the United States, and also how enormously contentious it was. There's a strain of American history writing about nature that has sort of been like, the United States were very special, close to nature. Nature was very important as we sang the United States into being. You know, nature's nation, right? My book is kind of a little kickback at that sort of cheerful story about natural history and like flower collecting and suddenly United States. Because it was really, as I show in this book, considerably more kind of complicated than that. Yeah?
We have the book in the Kellogg Library, and you are going to sign it.
Oh, I would be delighted to.
So, 2 questions. One is, did they move it out of miscellaneous at the museum?
An interesting question. A very interesting question. I don't know the answer to that question. It wouldn't surprise me if they did. Historians have a hard time getting at the facts about the past. So how did I know that things were arranged in that museum that way? Interestingly, it was just one single document. John Scudder printed a broadsheet advertising the museum, which listed the stuff he had in its categories. And there is one surviving copy of that broadsheet in the ephemera collection of the New York Historical Society. And it's from 1815 or something. So I knew where it was in 1815, right before the trial, and was a very happy camper, but I have no idea what happens after. So it would be nice to know. What I can tell you, though, is that in part, as a result of the hullabaloo around this trial and the very unhappy way that things turn out from the perspective of folks like yourselves, men of science and ladies of science, what happens is that the New York institution collapses. So that fantastic vision of New York as the philosopher kings, dead, killed. So the repercussions of the trial are actually, I argue in the conclusion of the book, pretty serious. That is, not serious for whether we ultimately decide whales are fish or not. You guys know very well that story had been in Europe substantially resolved by this period. I mean, you probably don't know that Linnaeus has whales and fish through the first 9 editions of the System of Nature. I bet there's nobody in here who knew that. 10th edition, 1758, is the first edition of Linnaeus that puts whales under mammal. Linnaeus is not the first naturalist to move whales out of fish. That's Jacques Brisson, about 3 years before, so in 1756 or something like that. But he does not move them under mammal. He moves them under a separate category at the same taxonomic rank as mammal and fish, which he calls plagiures, the sea bears. And he includes in the sea bears category manatees, stellar sea cow kind of stuff, and then all of the cetaceans. Which is just to say that this transition occurs a little later than you might have thought.
There's a parallel sort going on right now between raccoon dog and whether it's a dog or not. The main side of the United States has gotten some legislators in various states and on the Hill to try to pass legislation prohibiting the importation of fur of the raccoon dog.
Huh.
Well, the raccoon dog is not a raccoon and it's not a dog. It's a common name for an animal that has to be in the dog family, but it's no more a dog than a jackal or a...
I see. Where are they from? I've never heard of a raccoon dog. Where's their native habitat?
From eastern Asia. They've been farmed using the fur trade for about 100 years.
Very
Some
interesting.
call them the Asian raccoon, others call them the Finn raccoon. In Finland, they're large number.
Very interesting.
You think, is that going to come to trial?
Pardon?
Is that going to come to trial?
Well, Sam Pierre was sent a letter by some congressman wanting somebody here
It's
to
interesting.
say
It's interesting.
whether this is a dog or not.
It all comes back to the 20th century stuff, though, because what you guys, again, I think be surprised to know is that the primary use by the Soviets of the whale products they took in, not the oil, which was used for margarine, as you know, and for soap to some extent, but the granulated, desiccated meat products and the offal and stuff that was high enough quality not to be used as fertilizer was used to feed silver foxes in the fur farms in Eastern Soviet Union. It was just any number of... In fact, I have an article which is not published yet, but which may interest some of you. It's about kind of what I call the meat economy, and it shows that in a really surprising way, it was the development of the automobile which replaced horses in American cities and American transport systems between about 1895 and 1920 or so, that there's this unbelievable basically slaughter of horses, because there are hundreds of thousands, millions of horses that are no longer needed as a result of the development of the horseless carriage. And what that creates is a set of industries that are dependent on cheap flesh to feed as protein additives in chicken feed, development of increasingly industrialized agriculture in this period, extensive railway links, and now truck transportation of food products means that even as the automobile is replacing these horses, there's newly intensive agriculture and husbandry for domestic animals. When basically by 1920 all those horses have been killed and there is no longer this cheap source of meat, there's an enormous hole, and that hole gets filled by whale meat. So, the whale meat goes into chicken feed, goes into fertilizer, goes into animal food, all of which filling a niche in this weird meat economy that had been filled by these horses that had been taken offline over the... Yeah, crazy stuff. Maybe we have time for a couple more? Over here?
This is an opportunity to engage you as a historian, at least from my perspective. Would you care to speculate about what's happening today relative to documentation, electronic communication, and that kind of thing relative to what you might do if you were 100 years down the way and looking back at
Yeah.
intelligent design or whatever it might be, comparable issue?
It's so hard. I mean, it's a very interesting kind of methodological question for a historian. I had one of my advisors when I was in the UK was an early modern historian, which means he basically cuts off sometime around 1650. He did the period after the medieval period. In fact, historians are basically defined by the kinds of sources they can work with. Medievalists are defined by the fact that they have to do paleography, which means they have to be able to read medieval script. And medieval script is, you just have to know how to, you either can read it or you can't. You have to know the language. But even if you know the language and you can't read scribal hand from the 13th century, you can't be a medievalist. So medievalists are kind of bound to their material in that way. Early modernists who have printed books, what this advisor said to me was, he's like, I can't imagine working after 1650, because if you're an early modernist like me, you can basically know everything. By which he meant, by the time he was his age, 60 or so, he could basically know all the printed books that were relevant to his big area, because there were only maybe 10 or 15,000 of them, and if you do it for 20 years, you start to have a pretty good sense of many editions, lots of them, and stuff. You know this stuff. He says, after 1700 or so, I don't see how any of you people do it at all, he said, looking at the modernists, because with the steam print presses and the proliferation of newspapers, back in this period, newspapers were still quite rare. To belong to a newspaper was a little bit like belonging to a country club. You would get a copy, and it would be passed around to a group of friends, but it was not something that every person in New York got, because they were quite a commitment because of the taxes on paper products and the handset letterprint. So all that's to say that history has changed in terms of textual modes a number of times, with consequences for how historians do their work. Even me doing the 20th century whale stuff, the archival records of the IWC and those intergovernmental organizations, it's so instructive. If you ever walk over, you may have done, to Kellogg's papers. The Kellogg's files, it's 38, 39, skip a few years, 45, 46, 48, 52, 56, and by the time you get to 1968, he's a little, sort of 64 or whatever when he steps down, he's a little shaky by that point, but the volume of material that these organizations are generating is of an orders of magnitude difference. It's different in kind. You can't do the same kind of historical work even there. So you're pointing to a different issue, which is just the ephemerality of these sources that you guys are using. And there's a lot of fretting about this. If you pick up the most recent copy of the New York Review of Books, my former colleague, Robert Darnton, who's a French Revolutionary historian and an expert on the history of the book, has a very interesting essay in there about the future of libraries in this exact vein, the future of archives and libraries in a world where this stuff is being increasingly digitized and where lots of source material is just being lost to us because it's being done on email and stuff. Hard to say. I think that this will mark one of those transitional periods for historians in 200 years, like the difference between the Middle Ages and the early modern period. There'll be some people who do this period that we're talking about now, and there'll be a totally different kind of person than the people who do sort of 1993 forward. It's weird to have lived across one of those divides, because there aren't very many of them.
Did you see an actual copy of Mitchell's broadsheet about comparative anatomy?
I did.
Yeah. So they are.
There's one copy of that broadsheet which is tipped in to the back of the minute book of the society that he kind of produced it for, which I think was called the Agricultural and Economical Society of New York or something like that. But I only know of one copy.
I think the message still needs to be sent.
Yeah. He says that all the time.
Get that.
He needs that slide.
That's exactly.
You've got to get out there in the schools with some worms and some dissecting kits, right?
Yeah.
Yes, when I was writing this book, my wife is also a historian, but she's a legal historian, and her grasp of science is extremely limited. She's a very, very competent lawyer and a very competent legal historian. She was a clerk on the Supreme Court here and all that stuff. Very special lady. But, I mean, she's hazy on the difference between atoms and cells. She just doesn't do science. So when I have been talking about this stuff, she told me the story of failed effort in sort of 4th grade to dissect a worm, which gave her lifelong epistemological anxieties about the possibility of the production of truth in the sciences. You know, she said, I cut into this worm and it was just a disaster, and I just said, not going there, whatever. She became a deep skeptic, and a Pyrrhonian skeptic at the age of about 8, I think. So.
What happened to our LSD guy? Is he still alive?
He's dead. He died in 2000.
Of what?
He died basically of ripe old age at that point, despite the fact that he had been a kind of regular in the back pages of Omni magazine, proselytizing about different weird psychotropic products for sort of 20 years. He wore a jumpsuit and stuff and lived in California. He spent some time at Esalen. He did the whole trajectory of that, 65 to 75 thing. I have a popular piece coming out on him, which will be in Harper's Magazine at some point in the next couple of months if the editor and I ever agree on anything. And it's basically a piece. It's a piece about Lily, and then about the complicated and strange ways in which Lily didn't just spawn the kind of counterculture around dolphins and whales, but he also spawned, and here's where the Cold War is such a complicated period historically, the Cold War dolphin story, which you all probably have some inkling of, namely that there was and remains a Navy project to train dolphins for naval use, primarily in recovering underwater objects, some minesweeping, and briefly, again, you probably know that there was a swimmer interdiction program which was deployed in Vietnam at a place called Cam Ranh Bay, where a set of trained dolphins were sent out with a Navy SEAL team and used to stop Viet Cong sappers from sabotaging an American military depot. Not super successful, and spawned much more by way of kind of paranoid fantasy than interesting, substantial engagement. But the piece for Harper's, I went and found a couple of the guys, the Navy SEALs who worked with the animals, and I recovered the story of how that work was done. And I do a couple of interviews with this guy, Sam Ridgway. Some of you who are marine mammal people will certainly know Sam Ridgway, who's a fantastic guy and was the first veterinarian to work on the Navy's marine mammal program back when it was Forest Wood and so forth in the early 1960s. So actually, Lily, who'd gone to Caltech with a guy named William B. McLean, McLean went on in the military research establishment and became a heroic figure for developing the Sidewinder missile. And he ran the Naval Ordnance Testing Station in China Lake, and he read some of Lily's early writings about dolphin intelligence and basically invited him out to do a couple of informal presentations to the security establishment at China Lake. And this was before he tuned in, turned on, and dropped out. And so he was instrumental in seeding the Navy's engagement with marine mammals. And then he's basically squeezed out when he starts to look not quite presentable. But he's generationally a very interesting guy because Lily was active military during World War II. So we forget generationally that the counterculture in the Cold War, I mean, a guy like Lily was he would have been, he was in his 50s, late 40s, early 50s by that period. He had been one of the kind of right stuff guys working in avionics, real-time monitoring of flyboys' blood pressure and this kind of stuff. That kind of pants that keep your blood up during the experience of G-forces and stuff. He worked on all that kind of stuff. So he had pretty tight links to the military in a way that, again, we forget as a result of World War II. That whole generation of guys, almost all of them had been in the military in one way or another. So no matter how eccentric they started to look, they still had all their friends in the kind of military-industrial establishment, and he was very much one of those guys. So I write a little piece about the kind of two branches of dolphins that come out of Lily. One, sort of SeaWorld and women in bathing suits swimming with dolphins and using dolphins to heal people and all this kind of mystical stuff about the spiritualized dolphin. And then on the other hand, the fact that we still send dolphins to Persian Gulf to do minesweeping and so forth. Whether I've asked Sam about this. You may have your own opinion. I can't believe that we can't do machines. I think it's got to be some kind of a public relations thing that we're still using dolphins for that. But the guy who runs the center out in San Diego where they do this still insists that they haven't got machines that can do it as well as the trained dolphins do. So that's Lily. I should let people go.
Okay.
Thank you very much.